The smell of fresh apple pie drifted through the windows of 42 Maple Drive as Georgia Smith pulled her latest creation from the oven, her flour-dusted apron tied neatly around her waist. To her neighbors in the quiet suburb of Millbrook, Connecticut, she was exactly what she appeared to be, a 67-year-old widow who spent her days tending to her prize-winning rose garden, volunteering at the local food bank, and hosting book club meetings in her cozy living room every Thursday evening. What they didn't know was that the same gentle hands that kneaded bread dough and arranged flowers had once held classified files containing the locations of the world's most wanted war criminals. The woman who smiled warmly at the grocery store checkout and never missed Sunday service at First Methodist had spent 4 decades methodically tracking down monsters who thought they had escaped justice forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Georgia Smith adjusted the lace curtains in her kitchen window as she watched her neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, struggle with her overflowing garbage bins on that crisp October morning. Without hesitation, Georgia wiped her hands on her apron and hurried outside to help, her sensible shoes clicking softly on the sidewalk. "Oh, Georgia, you're such a dear," Mrs. Patterson huffed, grateful for the assistance. "I don't know what this neighborhood would do without you." Georgia smiled warmly, the kind of genuine expression that had made her beloved by everyone on Maple Drive for the past 15 years. "We all look out for each other here, Helen. That's what makes a community." As she helped carry the bins to the curb, Georgia's eyes automatically scanned the street with the practiced efficiency of someone trained to notice everything. The blue sedan parked 3 houses down had been there for 2 days, with the same coffee cup on the dashboard. The postal worker was running 20 minutes behind his usual schedule. Mrs. Chun from number 38 had installed a new security camera, angled just slightly toward the street. These observations flowed through Georgia's mind like water, cataloged and filed away with the unconscious precision of someone who had spent decades knowing that survival often depended on noticing what others missed. But to Helen Patterson, Georgia was simply the kind neighbor who always remembered to bring her garbage bins back up her driveway after collection day. The routine of suburban life had become Georgia's masterpiece of deception. Every Tuesday, she drove her modest Honda Civic to the farmer's market, where she carefully selected the ripest tomatoes and engaged in cheerful conversations about weather and grandchildren with vendors who had known her for years. Every Thursday evening, 8 women gathered in her living room to discuss the latest bestseller, sipping tea from delicate china cups, while debating plot twists and character motivations. What none of them knew was that Georgia's discussions of literary themes often drew from real experiences that would have left them speechless with horror. When they analyzed the psychological motivations of a thriller's villain, Georgia spoke from intimate knowledge of how evil rationalized itself. When they debated whether justice could ever truly be served for past crimes, Georgia's insights came from having personally ensured that justice was served, quietly and completely, dozens of times over 4 decades. Her house on Maple Drive was a carefully constructed sanctuary of normalcy. The living room featured family photographs that told a convincing story. Georgia as a young bride to her late husband Robert, vacation snapshots from visits to national parks, holiday gatherings with her sister's family in Oregon. The kitchen was filled with handwritten recipe cards, collected over years of perfecting dishes that she shared generously with neighbors, and church potlucks, but hidden behind a false wall in her basement workshop, accessible only through a concealed panel that looked like an electrical junction box, lay the true testament to Georgia Smith's extraordinary life. Filing cabinets contained meticulously organized dossiers on war criminals from conflicts spanning 5 decades. Maps marked with locations across 3 continents traced the movements of men who had thought themselves safely hidden in plain sight. Photographs, documents, and evidence that had taken years to collect told stories of justice served far from any courtroom. The workshop also contained items that would have seemed completely out of place in the home of a suburban grandmother. Multiple passports in different names, currency from a dozen countries, and communication equipment that connected her to a network of individuals whose existence was known to only a handful of people in the world's intelligence communities. Georgia had been recruited into the shadow world 43 years ago. Fresh out of Georgetown University with a degree in international relations and a burning desire to make the world a better place. What had started as a position with a humanitarian organization had gradually revealed itself to be something far more complex and dangerous. She had discovered a natural talent for languages, an almost supernatural ability to blend into any environment, and most importantly, an unwavering moral compass that never wavered even in the darkest circumstances. Her first assignment had been simple: locate a former concentration camp guard who had disappeared into the chaos of post-war Europe and was believed to be living under an assumed identity in South America. What should have been a straightforward intelligence-gathering mission had become something more when Georgia realized that official channels would never bring the man to justice. Too much time had passed, too many records had been lost or destroyed, and too many governments preferred to let sleeping demons lie. So Georgia had improvised. Using skills she didn't even know she possessed, she had orchestrated a situation where the war criminal's new life unraveled completely. His assumed identity crumbled, his crimes were exposed to his unsuspecting community, and he was eventually deported back to Europe to face trial. Justice had been served, quietly and efficiently, without fanfare or recognition. That first success had led to another assignment, and then another. Over the decades, Georgia had perfected the art of becoming whoever she needed to be. She had been a teacher in Argentina, tracking a doctor who had performed medical experiments on prisoners. She had worked as a librarian in Australia, methodically gathering evidence against a former SS officer who had been living peacefully as a respected member of his community for 30 years. She had spent 2 years as a missionary in Southeast Asia, patiently gaining the trust of a war criminal who had fled to the Philippines after committing atrocities in Vietnam. Each identity had been carefully constructed and completely believable. Georgia had learned to speak 7 languages fluently, to adapt her behavior to fit seamlessly into any culture, and to project whatever personality would best serve her mission. She could be stern or gentle, intellectual or simple, worldly or naive, depending on what the situation required. But of all her assumed identities, Georgia Smith, the widow of Millbrook, Connecticut, had been her longest and most successful creation. For 15 years, she had lived this life, tending her garden, volunteering at charity events, and maintaining friendships with people who saw exactly what she wanted them to see. A kind, ordinary woman who had lived a quiet, unremarkable life. Irony was that after decades of pretending to be someone else, the Georgia Smith identity had become more real to her than any other. She genuinely loved her garden, found real satisfaction in her volunteer work, and had formed authentic friendships with her neighbors. The lines between performance and reality had blurred until she sometimes forgot that this peaceful existence was supposed to be temporary. But Georgia's long hiatus from active hunting was about to end in a way she never could have anticipated. Hidden in her morning routine of coffee and newspaper reading was a ritual that connected her to a world most people never knew existed. Each day, she carefully reviewed obituaries, news reports, and personal announcements, not for neighborhood gossip, but for the coded messages that occasionally appeared there. A specific arrangement of words in a death notice, an unusual phrase in a wedding announcement, or a particular combination of details in a news story could contain instructions for her next assignment. This morning, as she settled into her favorite armchair with her second cup of coffee, Georgia's eyes fell on a small news item that made her blood run cold. The article was brief, buried on page 6 of the regional newspaper, reporting on a new resident of Sunrise Manor, an upscale retirement community just 20 miles away. Heinrich Müller, originally from Germany, had moved to the facility to be closer to his daughter's family. The article mentioned his age, 89, and noted that he had worked as an administrator for various European companies before retiring. To anyone else, it was a meaningless human interest story. But Georgia recognized the photograph immediately, despite the decades that had aged the face beyond easy recognition. The eyes were the same, cold and calculating, even in the grainy newspaper photo. This was Klaus Richter, a man she had been hunting for over 20 years, a war criminal who had overseen the execution of hundreds of civilians in occupied Poland and had vanished without a trace in 1978. As Georgia stared at the photograph, her peaceful morning routine shattered like glass. Klaus Richter, one of the most wanted war criminals still alive, was living comfortably just 20 miles from her kitchen table, believing himself safely hidden behind a new identity and the protection of advanced age. For the first time in 15 years, Georgia Smith felt the familiar surge of purpose that had driven her through 4 decades of dangerous work. The hunter was about to emerge from retirement, and Klaus Richter had no idea that his past had finally caught up with him. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Georgia's hands remained perfectly steady as she folded the newspaper and placed it beside her coffee cup, but her mind was already racing through possibilities and protocols she hadn't accessed in 15 years. Klaus Richter's appearance in Connecticut wasn't coincidence. Men like him didn't simply relocate for family reasons. There was always a deeper motive, always another layer to uncover. She walked to her kitchen window and gazed out at her garden, where morning dew still clung to the rose petals she had carefully cultivated over the years. To any observer, she appeared to be a woman contemplating her day's gardening tasks. In reality, she was mentally reviewing everything she remembered about Richter's case file and planning her next moves with the precision of a chess grandmaster. 23 years ago, Klaus Richter had been living in São Paulo, Brazil, working as a translator for a small import business. Georgia had spent 8 months establishing herself as a language instructor, slowly working her way into his social circle. She had been within days of exposing his true identity when he vanished overnight, leaving behind an apartment cleared of every personal item except for a single photograph, a family picture that had revealed he had a daughter living somewhere in North America. That photograph had been her only lead for over 2 decades. And now Heinrich Müller's family connection to Connecticut suddenly made perfect sense. His daughter hadn't just been a refuge. She had been his long-term escape plan. Georgia moved through her house with practiced casualness, knowing that maintaining her routine was crucial to her cover. She prepared her usual Tuesday grocery list, chatted briefly with her mailman about the upcoming election, and waved to Mr. Thompson as he backed out of his driveway for work. But beneath this performance of normalcy, she was methodically planning an operation that would require every skill she had acquired over 4 decades. Her first stop was the Millbrook Public Library, where she had volunteered for the past 3 years helping seniors with computer literacy classes. The head librarian, Margaret Chun, greeted her warmly as she settled into her usual workstation. "Early today, Georgia," Margaret observed. "The computer class isn't until this afternoon." "I know, dear," Georgia replied, adjusting her reading glasses with the practiced gesture of someone comfortable with technology despite her age. "I wanted to research some genealogy for my book club. We're reading a historical fiction novel, and I thought it would be interesting to trace some European family histories from that era." It was a perfect cover story, one that would explain hours of research into German records, immigration documents, and historical databases. Margaret smiled approvingly and left Georgia to her work, never suspecting that the sweet grandmother was actually diving into classified international databases through carefully constructed backdoor access that had taken her years to establish and maintain. Georgia's fingers moved across the keyboard with surprising speed and precision. Her first task was confirming Heinrich Muller's identity beyond any doubt. The newspaper photograph was convincing, but 23 years of aging could play tricks with facial recognition. She needed concrete proof before taking any action. Through a series of encrypted connections that bounced her digital footprint across several countries, Georgia accessed immigration records, social security databases, and medical files. Heinrich Muller had entered the United States 18 months ago on a family reunification visa, sponsored by his daughter Sarah Muller Davidson, a radiologist at Hartford Hospital. His documentation was flawless for someone who had supposedly lived quietly in Germany for decades. Georgia pulled up Klaus Richter's original file, stored in her private archive of war criminal documentation. Born in Munich in 1934, Richter had joined the SS in 1952 and rapidly advanced through the ranks due to his administrative efficiency and complete lack of moral conscience. By 1954, he was overseeing resettlement operations in occupied Poland, a euphemism that disguised the systematic murder of civilian populations. The photographs were damning. Young Klaus Richter, in his SS uniform, standing beside mass graves with the casual indifference of someone discussing the weather. Documents bearing his signature that ordered the execution of entire villages. Testimonies from survivors who described his methodical approach to genocide with chilling precision. But it was a dental record that provided Georgia with absolute certainty. Klaus Richter had distinctive dental work, a gold crown on his upper left molar, and a distinctive gap between his front teeth that had been documented during his brief capture by Allied forces in 1945. Heinrich Muller's medical records from Hartford Hospital, obtained through carefully exploited security vulnerabilities, showed identical dental characteristics. Klaus Richter was definitely alive, living comfortably in Connecticut, and completely unaware that his past had found him. Georgia's next challenge was reconnaissance. Sunrise Manor was an exclusive retirement community with sophisticated security systems and strict visitor protocols. She couldn't simply drive up and start asking questions without raising suspicions that could alert Richter to the danger. She needed a legitimate reason to access the facility and observe her target without detection. The solution came to her as she reviewed the retirement home's website. Sunrise Manor was actively seeking volunteers for their intergenerational connection program, which paired residents with community volunteers for weekly social visits. The program was designed to combat isolation among elderly residents while providing them with connections to the broader community. It was perfect. Georgia could apply as a volunteer, request assignment to residents who might appreciate conversations in German, and position herself to observe Richter while maintaining complete credibility. Her cover story would be unshakable, a retired woman wanting to use her language skills to help fellow seniors feel less isolated in their new country. That afternoon, Georgia called Sunrise Manor's volunteer coordinator, speaking with the slightly hesitant tone of someone unfamiliar with modern volunteer programs but eager to help. She explained that she had taught German language classes years ago and thought she might be able to provide companionship to residents who would appreciate speaking their native language. "That's wonderful, Mrs. Smith," the coordinator, Jessica Williams, responded enthusiastically. "We actually have several German-speaking residents who would love that kind of connection. When could you come in for an orientation?" "Would Thursday morning work?" Georgia asked, deliberately choosing a time that would allow her to observe the facility's daily routines during peak activity hours. "Perfect. I'll email you the paperwork to complete beforehand." "This is such a blessing." Mr. Mueller was just mentioning how much he misses speaking German with someone who understands the cultural context. Georgia's pulse quickened at the mention of Muller's name, but her voice remained perfectly steady. "That sounds lovely. I look forward to meeting him and the other residents." As she hung up the phone, Georgia allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction. In less than 6 hours, she had confirmed her target's identity, established a legitimate cover for surveillance, and positioned herself for regular access to Klaus Richter without raising any suspicions. But her work was far from over. The next phase would require careful preparation and flawless execution. She needed to research Richter's current life in detail, understand his routines and relationships, and most importantly, develop a strategy for exposing his true identity in a way that would ensure justice without putting innocent people at risk. That evening, as Georgia prepared dinner for one in her quiet kitchen, she began planning an operation that would bring a decades-long hunt to its conclusion. Klaus Richter had spent 23 years believing he was safe, surrounded by the comfortable anonymity of American suburban life. He was about to discover that some crimes cast shadows too long for any distance to escape, and that justice, while sometimes delayed, was never truly defeated. The woman who had spent 15 years perfecting the role of a harmless grandmother was about to remind the world why she had been one of the most effective war criminal hunters of her generation. And Klaus Richter, now going by Heinrich Müller, had no idea that his carefully constructed new life was about to unravel completely. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made Georgia's rose garden sparkle with frost. She dressed carefully for her volunteer orientation at Sunrise Manor, selecting a navy cardigan and sensible slacks that projected the image of a respectable grandmother while allowing her freedom of movement should circumstances require it. In her purse, alongside the typical contents any elderly woman might carry, she concealed a small digital recording device and a pen camera so sophisticated that its technology wouldn't be available to civilian markets for another 5 years. Drive to Sunrise Manor took Georgia through the affluent suburbs of West Hartford, where sprawling estates gave way to carefully manicured commercial developments. The retirement facility itself was impressive, a collection of brick buildings designed to resemble a New England college campus, complete with walking paths, gazebos, and gardens that would make any landscape architect proud. Jessica Williams, the volunteer coordinator, met Georgia in the main lobby with the kind of enthusiastic warmth that suggested she genuinely loved her job. She was perhaps 35, with kind eyes and the efficient manner of someone accustomed to managing both volunteers and residents with equal skill. "Mrs. Smith, welcome to Sunrise Manor," Jessica said, extending her hand. "Thank you so much for offering your time. Our German-speaking residents are going to be absolutely delighted." As Jessica led her through the orientation process, Georgia cataloged every detail of the facility's layout, security measures, and daily routines. The main entrance required keycard access after 6 p.m. Security cameras covered all common areas, but appeared to have blind spots near the emergency exits. Staff shifts changed at 7 a.m., 3 p.m., and 11 p.m., creating brief windows of reduced supervision. "Our residents have quite diverse backgrounds," Jessica explained as they walked through the main common area. "Many are first-generation immigrants who built successful lives here but sometimes feel disconnected from their cultural roots. Your language skills will mean so much to them." They passed through a spacious dining room where early lunch preparations were underway. Georgia noted the serving schedule, staffing patterns, and the general flow of resident activity. Everything she observed was automatically filed away in her memory, building a comprehensive picture of the environment where she would soon confront Klaus Richter. "Now I'd love for you to meet Heinrich Müller," Jessica said, leading Georgia toward a sunny sitting area near the library. "He moved here from Germany about 18 months ago to be closer to his daughter. He's been having some difficulty adjusting, I think partly because he misses being able to express himself fully in his native language. Georgia's heart rate increased slightly, but her expression remained pleasantly interested as they approached. A tall, thin man seated by a window with a book in his lap. At 89, Klaus Richter had aged into the appearance of a distinguished gentleman. His silver hair was neatly combed, his clothes expensive and well-tailored. To any casual observer, he looked like exactly what he claimed to be, a retired European businessman enjoying his golden years, but Georgia saw details that others missed. The way his eyes automatically tracked every person who entered his peripheral vision. The unconscious positioning of his chair that gave him clear sight lines to both entrances. The subtle tension in his posture that suggested a man who had never quite learned to relax completely. These were the habits of someone who had spent decades looking over his shoulder, waiting for the past to catch up. "Heinrich, I'd like you to meet Georgia Smith," Jessica said in English. "She's volunteered to spend time with our German-speaking residents. Georgia, this is Heinrich Müller." Richter looked up from his book, and for a moment, Georgia found herself staring directly into the eyes that had once watched mass executions with cold indifference. Time had softened his features, but those eyes remained exactly as they had appeared in photographs from 70 years ago, intelligent, calculating, and completely devoid of remorse. "Guten Tag, Herr Müller," Georgia said with a warm smile, extending her hand. "Ich freut mich sehr, Sie kennenzulernen." Richter's face immediately brightened with what appeared to be genuine pleasure. "Ah, wie wunderbar!" he exclaimed, rising. To shake her hand. "Sprechen Sie wirklich Deutsch?" "Das ist ein solche Freude." His German was flawless, but Georgia detected the slight regional accent that confirmed his Munich origins. More importantly, she noted the unconscious relaxation in his posture as he switched to his native language. This was a man who had been carefully controlling every aspect of his presentation in English, but who felt safe enough in German to let his guard down slightly. "I taught German language classes for many years," Georgia replied in German, settling into the chair across from him. "I understand how difficult it can be to feel truly understood when you can't express yourself in your mother tongue." Jessica beamed at their immediate connection. "I'll leave you two to get acquainted. Heinrich, Mrs. Smith will be visiting every Thursday morning from now on. I think you're going to become great friends." As Jessica departed, Georgia found herself alone with one of the most wanted war criminals in the world. The irony was almost overwhelming. She was posing as a kindly volunteer, while sitting across from a man responsible for the deaths of hundreds of innocent people. "You cannot imagine what a relief this is," Richter said in German, his voice carrying what seemed like genuine emotion. "I love my daughter dearly, and everyone here is very kind, but there are things that simply cannot be translated. Thoughts and feelings that only exist properly in German." Georgia nodded sympathetically, playing her role perfectly while studying every detail of his mannerisms and speech patterns. "I understand completely. Tell me about yourself, Heinrich. What brought you to America?" The next hour provided Georgia with invaluable intelligence as Richter spun his carefully constructed cover story. He claimed to have worked in administrative roles for various companies throughout Germany, eventually retiring comfortably and deciding to join his daughter in America as his health began to decline. His story was sophisticated and detailed, clearly rehearsed over many years, but Georgia caught the small inconsistencies that revealed the lies beneath. He mentioned working in Frankfurt during the 1960s, but his knowledge of the city's layout was clearly superficial. He claimed to have been involved in textile manufacturing, but his understanding of the industry's technical aspects was obviously borrowed from research rather than experience. Most tellingly, when Georgia casually mentioned visiting Munich in her youth, Richter's description of his supposed hometown was suspiciously vague for someone who claimed to have lived there for the first 30 years of his life. "You know," Georgia said carefully, "I have such an interest in German history. particularly the war years. It must have been difficult growing up during such turbulent times. For just a moment, something flickered behind Richter's eyes, a calculation. Assessment of how much to reveal. Yeah, those were complicated times, he said slowly. I was just a child, of course. One learned not to ask too many questions about what the adults were doing. It was a masterful deflection, acknowledging the era while positioning himself as an innocent bystander. Georgia recognized the practiced nature of this response. Klaus Richter had clearly spent decades perfecting his story of wartime innocence. Of course, Georgia agreed gently. Children had no control over the terrible things that happened. It's important to remember that most Germans were just trying to survive. She watched carefully as Richter relaxed slightly at her apparent acceptance of his narrative. This was exactly the kind of response he had been hoping for: sympathy for the ordinary Germans, who had supposedly been victims of circumstances beyond their control. As their first meeting drew to a close, Georgia had accomplished far more than simply establishing contact. She had confirmed beyond any doubt that Heinrich Müller was indeed Klaus Richter, assessed his current psychological state and defensive strategies, and most importantly, established herself as someone he could trust with his carefully curated version of history. I have so enjoyed our conversation, Richter said as Georgia prepared to leave. Will you really return next week? Absolutely, Georgia assured him with a warm smile. I'm looking forward to hearing more about your life in Germany. Perhaps you could tell me about your family. I'm sure you have wonderful stories to share. As she walked back through the facility's corridors, Georgia was already planning her next moves. Klaus Richter felt safe, protected by his false identity, and the comfortable anonymity of American retirement living. He had no idea that his new friend Georgia was methodically gathering the evidence that would finally bring him to justice. The hunter had made first contact with her prey, and the real game was about to begin. Over the following weeks, Georgia Smith became a fixture at Sunrise Manor every Thursday morning, arriving with homemade cookies and a cheerful demeanor that endeared her to staff and residents alike. To everyone who observed their weekly meetings, she and Heinrich Müller had developed exactly the kind of friendship the volunteer program was designed to foster too. Elderly people finding comfort in shared language and cultural understanding. The reality was far more complex and dangerous. Georgia had spent the past 3 Thursdays methodically constructing a psychological profile of Klaus Richter that would have impressed intelligence analysts half her age. She learned that he woke each morning at precisely 6:30 a.m. and took his coffee black in the dining room while reading 3 different newspapers. He never ate lunch in the main dining area, preferring to take meals in his private apartment. Most tellingly, he had developed friendships only with residents whose hearing was significantly impaired, people unlikely to overhear conversations or remember details accurately. During their German conversations, Georgia had carefully tested the boundaries of Richter's fabricated identity. She discovered that his knowledge of post-war German reconstruction was encyclopedic, clearly the result of decades of studying the period he claimed to have lived through. But his understanding of daily life details was suspiciously academic. He knew about food rationing policies, but couldn't accurately describe the taste of ersatz coffee. He could recite statistics about industrial recovery, but had never mentioned the smell of coal smoke that characterized German winters well into the 1960s. Most importantly, Georgia had begun to understand the psychological fortress Richter had built around his past. He wasn't simply hiding his war crimes. He had genuinely convinced himself that Klaus Richter and Heinrich Müller were entirely different people. The war criminal was someone he had buried so deeply that he could discuss the Nazi era with apparent sincerity while maintaining complete psychological distance from his own actions. This Thursday morning, Georgia arrived at Sunrise Manor with a specific objective. She had spent the previous evening crafting a strategy to begin dismantling Richter's defenses, using techniques she had perfected over 4 decades of extracting confessions from war criminals who thought themselves safely hidden. "Guten Morgen, Heinrich," she said warmly as she settled into her usual chair across from him. "How are you feeling today?" Richter's face brightened with the genuine pleasure that had characterized their developing friendship. "Much better now that you're here, Georgia. I've been looking forward to our conversation all week." Georgia had noticed that Richter seemed to experience genuine loneliness, isolated not just by language barriers, but by the enormous weight of secrets he could never share. In an ironic twist, their weekly meetings had become the highlight of his carefully circumscribed existence moments, when he could speak freely in his native language, without the constant vigilance required to maintain his false identity in English. "I've been thinking about our conversation last week," Georgia said, opening her purse to retrieve a small photo album. "You mentioned how much you missed certain aspects of German culture. I thought you might enjoy looking at some photographs from my travels there over the years." The album was genuine. Georgia had indeed visited Germany numerous times over the decades, though always in pursuit of war criminals rather than tourism. The photograph showed landmarks, festivals, and everyday scenes that she knew would trigger powerful emotional responses in someone who had genuinely grown up in Germany. As Richter slowly turned through the pages, Georgia watched his face carefully. His reactions to images of Munich were particularly telling, moments of genuine recognition mixed with careful restraint, as if he were constantly editing his responses to avoid revealing too much familiarity with locations he supposedly hadn't seen in decades. "This photograph," Richter said suddenly, pointing to an image of a small church in a Munich suburb. "I know this place. My family attended services there when I was very young. It was a small slip, but a significant one." According to his cover story, Heinrich Müller's family had lived in central Munich. The church in the photograph was in Schwabing, a district that matched Klaus Richter's actual childhood neighborhood rather than his fabricated background. Georgia made no immediate reaction to the inconsistency, simply nodding with interest as if filing away a pleasant personal detail. But internally, she noted another crack in his carefully constructed facade. "Tell me about your family," Georgia said gently, turning to a page showing a traditional German Christmas market. "Do you have happy memories of celebrations like this?" Richter's expression grew wistful, and for a moment, Georgia saw something genuine beneath his layers of deception. "Christmas was always special," he said quietly. "My mother made the most wonderful stollen, and my father, he would take me to the markets to choose ornaments for our tree." The emotion in his voice was real, and Georgia realized she was glimpsing Klaus Richter's actual childhood, memories, moments of innocence that existed before he became a monster. It was a humanizing revelation that made her task both easier and more psychologically complex. "Your parents sound like they were loving people," Georgia observed carefully. "It must have been difficult for them during the war years." "They died early," Richter said quickly, his defenses automatically reasserting themselves, "before the worst of it began. Perhaps it was a blessing. They never had to see what Germany became." Georgia recognized this as another carefully crafted element of his cover story, designed to eliminate any witnesses to his actual wartime activities, while positioning his family as innocent victims rather than potential collaborators. "You know," Georgia said, seemingly changing the subject while actually executing a carefully planned maneuver, "I've always been fascinated by how ordinary people survive such extraordinary times. The choices they had to make, the compromises they were forced to accept." She paused, watching Richter's reaction carefully. "I imagine many people did things they never thought they were capable of, simply to survive." Richter's hand stilled on the photograph album, and Georgia saw something flicker in his eyes, a moment of recognition that she was approaching dangerous territory. But rather than deflecting, he seemed to consider her words seriously. "Survival. Requires adaptability, he said slowly, his voice taking on a different quality. People today, with their comfortable lives and clear moral choices, they cannot understand what it was like when every day brought new terrors, new impossible decisions. Georgia leaned forward slightly, her expression sympathetic and encouraging. This was the opening she had been working toward for weeks, the moment when Richter began to justify rather than deny. Of course, she agreed gently. It's easy to judge from a distance, but none of us really know what we would have done in those circumstances. The important thing is that people tried to maintain their humanity wherever possible. Richter nodded emphatically, clearly grateful for what he interpreted as understanding and forgiveness. Exactly. There were good people who found themselves in impossible situations. Not everyone who wore a uniform was a monster, many were. Just young men trying to serve their country as they understood it. It was a classic rationalization that Georgia had heard from dozens of war criminals over the decades. The gradual shift from "I wasn't there" to "I was there but I was innocent" to "I was there and involved, but I had no choice" to "I was there and made difficult choices, but I was still a good person." "I'm sure you're right," Georgia said warmly. "History is never as simple as the textbooks make it seem. Real people making real decisions in impossible circumstances." As their conversation continued, Georgia carefully guided Richter through increasingly specific discussions of wartime experiences, always framing her questions in terms of general historical interest rather than personal inquiry. She spoke about the complexity of military hierarchies, the pressure young men faced to follow orders, and the tragic circumstances that sometimes forced good people to make terrible choices. With each exchange, Richter became more comfortable with discussing the war years, more willing to acknowledge the moral ambiguity that he claimed characterized the period. Georgia was methodically creating a psychological environment where confession might eventually feel like relief rather than self-destruction. But she was also acutely aware that she was walking an incredibly fine line. Push too hard or too fast, and Richter would recognize the manipulation and withdraw behind his defenses. Move too slowly, and she risked losing the opportunity entirely at 89. Klaus Richter might not have many years left to face justice for his crimes. As she prepared to leave that Thursday morning, Georgia felt the satisfaction of a master craftsperson who had spent another day carefully shaping her materials toward the desired outcome. Klaus Richter was beginning to trust her with increasingly sensitive admissions, and more importantly, he was starting to psychologically prepare himself for the possibility of discussing his actual wartime experiences. The hunter was methodically tightening her web, and her prey was walking willingly into the trap, guided by his own desperate need for understanding and absolution from someone who seemed to offer judgment-free acceptance of the past's moral complexities. But Georgia knew that the most dangerous phase of her operation was yet to come. Soon, she would have to stop building trust and start demanding truth. And Klaus Richter, despite his aged appearance and comfortable circumstances, remained a highly intelligent and potentially dangerous man who had successfully evaded justice for over 70 years. The October rain drummed against the windows of Sunrise Manor as Georgia made her way through the familiar corridors for what she knew would be the most crucial Thursday morning of her 15-year retirement. In her purse, alongside the usual homemade cookies and photo albums, she carried a small leather journal that she had spent the previous evening preparing with meticulous care. The journal appeared to be nothing more than a grandmother's memoir project, handwritten recollections of her late husband's military service, complete with faded photographs and yellowed newspaper clippings. But every element had been carefully selected to serve as psychological triggers, designed to lower Klaus Richter's defenses and create the emotional conditions necessary for him to finally confront his buried past. Georgia had spent the previous week analyzing recordings of their conversations, identifying the specific phrases and emotional cues that made Richter most responsive. She had noticed that he became particularly animated when discussing the concept of duty, almost desperate when touching on themes of forgiveness, and dangerously vulnerable when the conversation turned to the weight of carrying secrets across. Decades. Today, she would exploit all of these psychological pressure points with the precision of a surgeon. "Heinrich," she said warmly as she approached his usual chair by the window, "you look troubled this morning. Is everything all right?" Richter glanced up from his untouched coffee, and Georgia immediately noticed the signs of a sleepless night. His usually impeccable appearance was slightly disheveled. His eyes carried dark circles, and his hands trembled almost imperceptibly as he reached for his cup. "Ah, Georgia," he said in German, his voice carrying a weariness that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than physical fatigue. "I've been having the dreams again. The ones I thought had finally stopped." Georgia settled into her chair with practiced concern, recognizing that something had shifted in Richter's psychological state since their last meeting. "What kind of dreams, Heinrich? Sometimes talking about them can help." For a long moment, Richter stared out the window at the rain-soaked gardens. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Dreams about snow, about faces in the snow. Young faces, old faces. All of them looking at me with questions I can never answer." Georgia felt her pulse quicken. After weeks of careful maneuvering, Klaus Richter was beginning to crack under the weight of suppressed memories. The psychological pressure she had been gradually building was finally breaking through his carefully constructed defenses. "Snow can represent many things in dreams," she said gently. "Sometimes it's about purity, sometimes about covering things up. What do you think those faces were asking you?" Richter's hands clenched involuntarily around his coffee cup. "They want to know why things happened the way they did. Why I couldn't." He stopped abruptly, as if catching himself. On the edge of a revelation, he wasn't ready to make Georgia recognize the moment with the instincts of a predator sensing wounded prey. This was the opening she had been working toward for 2 months, the psychological breakthrough that could lead to a complete confession. But she also knew that pushing too hard at this crucial moment could cause Richter to retreat permanently behind his defenses. "Heinrich," she said softly, reaching across to place her hand gently on his arm, "whatever happened in your past, whatever you've been carrying all these years, you don't have to carry it alone anymore." Richter looked at her with eyes that suddenly seemed far older than his 89 years. "You don't understand, Georgia. Some burdens are too heavy to share. Some truths are too terrible to speak. I think I understand more than you might imagine." Georgia replied, carefully opening her leather journal to a page she had prepared specifically for this moment. "My husband Robert served in the war, you know. He was with the American forces that liberated some of the camps in Germany." She turned the journal toward Richter, revealing a genuine photograph of a young American soldier standing beside the gates of Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. The image was real. Georgia had obtained it from military archives, but the soldier wasn't her husband. She had never been married. The entire domestic life she had constructed in Millbrook was as fictional as Heinrich Muller's identity. Robert never talked about what he saw there, Georgia continued, watching Richter's face carefully as he stared at the photograph. But sometimes, in the middle of the night, he would cry out in his sleep. He would say names, German names, and beg someone to forgive him for not arriving sooner. Richter's breathing became shallow as he studied the photograph. Georgia could see him struggling between the desire to maintain his cover and the desperate need to finally speak the truth to someone who might understand. "He told me once," Georgia pressed on, "that the hardest part wasn't seeing the victims. It was seeing the guards, the administrators, the ordinary-looking men who had done such extraordinary evil. He said they looked so normal, like people you might meet in a grocery store or sit next to in church." "Your husband was a good man," Richter said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "He was trying to save people. He stopped again. But this time the pause felt different, less like retreat and more like preparation. Georgia sensed that Klaus Richter was standing at the edge of a psychological precipice, ready to either leap into truth or pull back into the safety of lies. She made a calculated decision to push him toward the leap. "Heinrich," she said, using his false name deliberately, "I need to tell you something. My husband wasn't the only one who served in the war. I've spent my entire adult life trying to understand what happened during those years. I've spoken with survivors, with liberators, and yes, with perpetrators. People who did terrible things and spent decades trying to find some way to live with what they had done." Richter's eyes widened slightly, and Georgia saw the first flicker of suspicion cross his features. But rather than backing down, she pressed forward with the most dangerous gambit of her career. "I know who you are, Klaus." The words hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Richter's face went completely white, and for a moment, Georgia thought he might collapse from the shock. But then something extraordinary happened. Instead of denial or panic, his expression shifted to something that looked almost like relief. "You know," he said, and it wasn't a question. The careful pronunciation of Heinrich Müller's polished English was gone, replaced by the harder consonants of Klaus Richter's native German. "How long have you known?" "Since the first day we met," Georgia replied honestly. "I've been hunting you for 23 years. Richter closed his eyes and leaned back in his chair, as if a tremendous weight had suddenly been lifted from his shoulders. 23 years, he repeated slowly. "Since Snow Paulo." "Since Snow Paulo, Georgia." "Confirmed. You disappeared the night before I was going to expose you. I've been wondering for decades how you knew I was coming." For the first time since she had known him, Klaus Richter smiled, not the careful, pleasant expression of Heinrich Müller, but something genuine and terrible. "I didn't know you were coming for me specifically. But I had contingency plans. I always had contingency plans." Georgia felt a chill of recognition. This was the voice of the man who had orchestrated the deaths of hundreds of people, the cold intelligence that had kept him free for over 70 years. Heinrich Müller had been a carefully constructed mask, but Klaus Richter was the monster underneath. "Why don't you run now?" she asked, genuinely curious. "You could disappear again. You've done it before." Richter shook his head slowly. "I'm 89 years old, Georgia. I'm tired. So very tired of running, of hiding, of being someone else. Every day. Do you know what it's like to live for 70 years without ever being able to speak your own name?" Georgia studied his face, seeing something she hadn't expected, not remorse. Exactly, but a kind of psychological exhaustion that came from carrying secrets too large for any one person to bear. "Tell me about Poland," she said quietly. "Tell me about the villages." For a long moment, Richter was silent. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he began to speak. "It was winter, 1943. The snow was so deep that the trucks couldn't make it all the way to the villages. We had to walk the last 2 kilometers. And I remember thinking how beautiful it was, how peaceful, like a Christmas card." Georgia activated the recording device in her purse, knowing that whatever came next would be the testimony she had spent decades trying to obtain. "I was 29 years old," Richter continued, his voice gaining strength as he finally gave voice to memories he had suppressed for 70 years. "I had been told these were partisan strongholds, that the people there were enemies of the Reich. I believed it, Georgia. I genuinely believed we were protecting German soldiers by eliminating threats." "But you knew they were civilians," Georgia said, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact. "Of course I knew," Richter replied, his voice now carrying a terrible clarity. "Children don't carry weapons. Old women don't plant bombs. But I had been trained to see enemies everywhere, to believe that mercy was weakness, and that weakness could cost German lives." Georgia listened as Klaus Richter, after 70 years of silence, began to confess to crimes that had haunted the nightmares of an entire generation. He spoke with the methodical precision of someone who had been carrying these memories in perfect, terrible detail for decades. He described the systematic nature of the operations, the careful planning that went into each pacification action. He explained how they would surround villages at dawn, how they would separate the residents into groups, how they would make the decisions about who would live and who would die. I told myself I was following orders, Richter said, his voice now steady and clear. I told myself I was serving my country. But the truth is, Georgia, I was good at it. I was efficient. I was promoted because I could organize mass murder with the same attention to detail that another man might use to plan a factory production line. Georgia felt a complex mixture of triumph and revulsion as she listened to the confession she had spent half her life trying to obtain. This was the evidence that would finally bring Klaus Richter to justice, but it was also the detailed account of atrocities that would haunt her own dreams for years to come. How many people died on your orders? She asked. Richter looked directly at her, and Georgia saw that his eyes were completely dry. There were no tears, no visible signs of remorse, only the terrible clarity of someone finally speaking the complete truth. 847, he said without hesitation. I know the exact number because I kept meticulous records. Every name, every age, every family connection. I told myself it was necessary for administrative purposes, but I think I knew even then that someday I would need to remember them all. Georgia stared at him, struck by the horrifying precision of his memory. You remember all of them? Every face, Richter confirmed. Every name. The 5-year-old boy who hid behind his mother's skirt. The elderly priest who asked if he could say a prayer before we shot him. The teenage girl who begged me to spare her younger brother. I remember them all, Georgia. They visit me in my dreams every night, and they ask me the same question. Why? For the first time since she had known him, Georgia saw something that might have been genuine emotion cross Klaus Richter's face. But it wasn't remorse or regret. It was the exhausted desperation of someone who had been carrying an impossible burden for too long. And what do you tell them? Georgia asked. Richter was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the rain-soaked grounds of Sunrise Manor. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. I tell them the truth. That I was a coward who chose to follow orders rather than accept the consequences of refusing them. That I was a young man who believed that duty mattered more than conscience. That I was a monster who convinced himself he was a patriot. Georgia felt the weight of the moment settling around them. After 70 years of hiding, Klaus Richter was finally admitting not just to his crimes, but to the complete moral bankruptcy that had made them possible. What happens now? Richter asked, looking at her with eyes that seemed almost curious. Do you call the police? Do you expose me to the media? Do you let the world know that Heinrich Müller was a lie and that Klaus Richter never really died? Georgia considered the question carefully. She had spent decades imagining this moment, planning exactly how she would bring Klaus Richter to justice. But now that the moment had arrived, she realized that the reality was far more complex than her fantasies had anticipated. I don't know, she said honestly. I've been hunting you for so long that I never really planned what would happen after I found you. Richter nodded slowly. I understand. You've been living a lie almost as long as I have. The hunter and the hunted, both of us trapped in roles we created so long ago that we've forgotten who we really are underneath. Georgia felt a chill of recognition at his words. For 70 years, Klaus Richter had been running from his past while she had been chasing it. Both of them had constructed elaborate false identities. Both of them had sacrificed any possibility of normal human relationships. Both of them had become prisoners of history. We're more alike than either of us wants to admit, Richter continued. You've spent your entire life pursuing justice. But have you ever asked yourself what justice really means? Is it punishment? Is it truth? Is it simply the satisfaction of finally catching someone who has been running for too long. Georgia stared at him, disturbed by the uncomfortable accuracy of his observations. In her pursuit of war criminals, had she become something inhuman herself? Had her dedication to justice cost her the ability to live a genuinely human life? "Justice," she said finally, "is making sure that the 847 people you murdered are not forgotten. It's ensuring that their families know what happened to them. It's preventing you from dying peacefully in your sleep, surrounded by people who think you're a harmless old man." Richter nodded slowly. "Yes," he said quietly. "I think you're right. They deserve to be remembered. They deserve to have their story told. And I deserve to face the consequences of what I did, even if those consequences come 70 years too late." Georgia looked at the man who had been her quarry for more than 2 decades, seeing him clearly for the first time. Klaus Richter was not the monster she had imagined. He was something far more disturbing. He was a human being who had committed monstrous acts, a man who had spent 70 years living with the weight of his choices, and who had finally reached the point where the burden of secrets had become heavier than the fear of consequences. "Are you ready to tell the world who you really are?" she asked. Richter closed his eyes and took a deep breath. "I've been ready for 70 years, he said. "I just didn't know it until now." As the rain continued to fall outside the windows of Sunrise Manor, Georgia Smith began to plan the final phase of an operation that had consumed her entire adult life. Klaus Richter's confession was only the beginning. Now came the far more complex task of ensuring that justice was served without destroying the innocent lives that had become entangled with Heinrich Muller's carefully constructed false identity. The hunter had finally caught her prey. But she was about to discover that the end of a 70-year chase was not a conclusion. It was the beginning of an entirely new and more complicated story. The following morning brought an unexpected visitor to 42 Maple Drive. Georgia was tending to her roses when a black sedan pulled into her driveway, its tinted windows reflecting the early autumn sun. She recognized the vehicle immediately. Federal agents had a particular preference for unremarkable cars that somehow managed to announce their official nature through their very attempt at anonymity. Agent Sarah Chun emerged from the passenger seat, her movements precise and economical. Georgia had encountered her type before, career intelligence officers who carried themselves with the quiet confidence of people accustomed to operating in the shadows. Behind her, a younger man in an ill-fitting suit struggled to extract himself from the driver's seat with considerably less grace. "Mrs. Smith," Agent Chun called out, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone delivering news that could go either way. "I'm Agent Chun, FBI. This is Agent Rodriguez. We'd like to speak with you about your volunteer work at Sunrise Manor." Georgia's hands remained steady as she continued pruning her roses, though her mind immediately began calculating possibilities. Klaus Richter's confession had been recorded, but she hadn't yet decided how to use it. The appearance of federal agents suggested that events were moving beyond her control in ways she hadn't anticipated. "Of course," Georgia replied, setting down her gardening shears with deliberate calm. "Would you like to come inside? I was just about to make coffee." Agent Chun's eyes swept across Georgia's modest home, taking in the perfectly maintained garden, the comfortable suburban normalcy, the complete absence of anything that might suggest the presence of one of the world's most effective war criminal hunters. "That would be very kind, Mrs. Smith." As they settled around Georgia's kitchen table, Agent Rodriguez fumbled with a digital recorder while Agent Chun opened a manila folder filled with documents. The younger agent's nervousness was palpable, but Chun radiated the controlled intensity of someone who had been waiting for this conversation for a long time. "Mrs. Smith," Agent Chun began, 3 days ago, Heinrich Mueller contacted the FBI field office in Hartford. He claimed to have information about war crimes committed during World War II and requested to speak with federal investigators." Georgia felt her pulse quicken. but kept her expression carefully neutral. How terrible. I hope he's able to provide useful information to help the families of victims find closure. He specifically requested that you be present during his interview. Agent Chun continued, watching Georgia's reaction carefully. He said he had already confessed to you and wanted you to verify the accuracy of his statements. The revelation hit Georgia like a physical blow. Klaus Richter had outmaneuvered her again, turning himself in before she could decide how to proceed with the evidence she had gathered. By involving federal authorities, he had taken control of the narrative and positioned himself as a cooperative witness rather than a captured fugitive. I'm not sure why he would make such a request, Georgia said carefully. We've had pleasant conversations about his experiences in Germany, but nothing that would require federal involvement. Agent Chun leaned forward slightly, her demeanor shifting to something more direct. Mrs. Smith, Heinrich Müller claims to be Klaus Richter, a war criminal who has been on international wanted lists for over 70 years. He says you've been investigating him for decades and that you have evidence of his crimes. Georgia met Chun's gaze steadily, recognizing that her carefully constructed cover was about to be completely dismantled. Agent Chun, I'm a retired schoolteacher who volunteers at a nursing home. I think Mr. Müller may be experiencing some form of dementia-related confusion. Are you familiar with the name Lydia Hartman? Agent Chun asked, sliding a photograph across the table. The image showed a woman in her 30s with dark hair and intelligent eyes, photographed in what appeared to be a hotel lobby in Buenos Aires. Georgia recognized the picture. Immediately, it had been taken during her pursuit of a Nazi doctor in 1987, one of dozens of false identities she had used over the decades. I'm afraid I don't recognize her, Georgia said, though she knew the denial was pointless. If Agent Chun had that photograph, she had access to files that contained Georgia's entire operational history. Lydia Hartman was the identity used by an American intelligence asset who spent 8 months in Argentina tracking Klaus Richter in 2001. Agent Chun explained. Hotel records show that she disappeared from São Paulo on the same night that Richter vanished from his apartment. Agent Rodriguez stopped fumbling with the recorder and looked up with barely concealed excitement. The facial recognition software matches Lydia Hartman to surveillance footage from 17 different countries over the past 40 years. Hotels, airports, government buildings, always in locations where war criminals were subsequently exposed or disappeared. Georgia realized that her decades of careful operational security had been undermined by technology that hadn't existed during most of her career. Digital surveillance systems, facial recognition databases, and international information sharing had created a trail of evidence that would have been impossible to detect in the analog world where she had learned her craft. Mrs. Smith, Agent Chun said, her voice carrying a note of respect that hadn't been there before. You've been operating as an unofficial war crimes investigator for over 4 decades. You've been responsible for the capture or exposure of at least 23 individuals on international wanted lists. You've never taken credit, never sought recognition, and never involved official channels unless absolutely necessary. Georgia felt a strange sense of relief at having her life's work finally acknowledged, even as she recognized the enormous complications that official recognition would bring. If what you're saying were true, Agent Chun, what would happen to such a person? That depends, Agent Chun replied. Are they willing to cooperate with federal authorities to ensure that Klaus Richter's confession is properly documented, and that justice is served through official channels? The question hung in the air between them, and Georgia realized that she was being offered a choice between continued secrecy and official partnership. After 43 years of working alone, the possibility of institutional support was both appealing and terrifying. Before I answer that question, Georgia said, I need to know something. How long have you known about my activities? Agent Chun exchanged a glance with her partner before responding. We've been aware of patterns in war criminal exposures for About 15 years. Someone was consistently one step ahead of our investigations, always managing to gather evidence that we couldn't access through official channels. We started calling you the Ghost because you seemed to appear whenever justice needed to be served, then vanish without leaving any trace. 3 years ago, Agent Rodriguez added, we started correlating surveillance footage and travel records. The facial recognition matches began appearing about 18 months ago, but we couldn't identify you until Klaus Richter specifically named you in his confession. Georgia processed this information, realizing that her retirement in Millbrook hadn't ended her career, it simply changed its nature. Even while living as a suburban grandmother, she had remained under observation by intelligence agencies that respected her effectiveness even as they struggled to understand her methods. Klaus Richter is 89 years old, Georgia said. Finally, even if he confesses to everything, even if he provides complete documentation of his crimes, he may not live long enough to stand trial. Is the pursuit of justice worth the resources required to prosecute a man who may die before facing punishment? Agent Chun's expression grew serious. Mrs. Smith, Klaus Richter isn't just confessing to his own crimes. He's offering to provide information about other war criminals who may still be alive, hiding in plain sight just as he was. He claims to have maintained contact with a network of former Nazis who have been protecting each other for decades. The revelation changed everything. Georgia had assumed that Klaus Richter's confession would be the end of her career, the final resolution of a decades-long pursuit. Instead, it was potentially the beginning of the largest war crimes investigation in modern history. He wants to make a deal, Agent Rodriguez explained. Full cooperation in exchange for a guarantee that his daughter won't be prosecuted for unknowingly harboring a fugitive. He also wants assurance that his confession will be used to identify other war criminals rather than simply punishing him. Georgia felt a grudging respect for Klaus Richter's final gambit. Even in confession, he was thinking strategically, using his capture as an opportunity to potentially expose an entire network of hidden war criminals. It was the kind of calculated move that had kept him free for 70 years. What kind of cooperation are you looking for from me? Georgia asked. Agent Chun opened her folder and withdrew a thick stack of documents. We need you to verify the accuracy of Richter's statements against your own investigation files. We need you to help us understand his psychological profile and predict how he might try to manipulate the process. Most importantly, we need you to help us evaluate the credibility of the information he provides about other suspects. Georgia realized that she was being offered something she had never expected. The opportunity to use her decades of experience and accumulated knowledge as part of an official investigation. Instead of working alone in the shadows, she could finally operate with the full resources of the federal government behind her. There's one more thing, Agent Chun said, her voice dropping to a more confidential tone. Klaus Richter specifically requested that you be present during his formal interrogation. He claims he'll only provide complete information if you're there to verify his statements. Why would he want that? Georgia asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. He says you're the only person who understands the full scope of what he's done and the historical context of his crimes. Agent Rodriguez explained. He doesn't trust federal agents to appreciate the complexity of the situation or to use his information effectively. Georgia stood up from the kitchen table and walked to her window, looking out at the quiet street where she had spent 15 years, perfecting the role of an ordinary retiree. The life she had built in Millbrook had been a carefully constructed illusion, but it had also become genuinely meaningful to her. The friendships she had formed, the community connections she had developed, the peaceful routines she had established, all of it would be shattered by her emergence from the shadows. If I agree to cooperate, she said without turning around, what happens to Georgia Smith? Agent Chun's voice was gentle but honest. Georgia Smith was always a cover identity, just like all the others. but we can ensure that your actual identity remains classified and that your privacy is protected as much as possible." Georgia turned back to face the two agents, seeing in their expressions the recognition of someone who had dedicated her entire life to a cause larger than herself. Agent Chun's respectful demeanor and Agent Rodriguez's barely concealed admiration told her that they understood the magnitude of what she had accomplished working alone for 4 decades. "When do you need my answer?" Georgia asked. "Klaus Richter's formal interrogation is scheduled for Monday morning," Agent Chun replied. "We need to know by tomorrow whether you'll be there." As the agents prepared to leave, Georgia walked them to the door, her mind already beginning to process the implications of stepping out of retirement and into the most complex case of her career. Klaus Richter's confession was only the beginning of what could become the largest war crimes investigation in history. "Agent Chun," Georgia said as they reached the front door, "there's something you should know. Klaus Richter is one of the most intelligent and manipulative individuals I've ever encountered. He spent 70 years staying one step ahead of people like you. Don't underestimate him just because he's old and appears to be cooperating." Agent Chun nodded grimly. "That's exactly why we need you there on Monday. You're the only person who's ever successfully cornered him." As the black sedan pulled out of her driveway, Georgia returned to her garden, but her roses suddenly seemed like artifacts from a life that was rapidly receding into the past. Klaus Richter had once again changed the rules of their decades-long game, and she was about to discover whether her skills as a hunter could be adapted to work within the constraints of official law enforcement. The quiet suburban street where she had spent 15 years hiding in plain sight was about to become the launching point for the most dangerous and complex operation of her career. And somewhere in a comfortable retirement facility 20 miles away, Klaus Richter was waiting to see whether the woman who had spent half her life hunting him would accept his final challenge. The federal building in Hartford loomed against the gray Monday morning sky like a monument to bureaucratic authority. Georgia sat in the passenger seat of Agent Chun's sedan, watching streams of government employees flow through the building's security checkpoints with the mechanical precision of people accustomed to routine. She had traded her comfortable cardigan and gardening clothes for a sharp navy suit that transformed her from suburban grandmother into something far more formidable. "Second thoughts?" Agent Chun asked, noting Georgia's contemplative silence as they pulled into the underground parking garage. "About Klaus Richter?" "Never," Georgia replied, adjusting the small recording device concealed in her lapel. "But I've spent 43 years avoiding rooms exactly like the one we're about to enter. Government buildings have a way of turning independent operators into official assets." Agent Chun guided them through a maze of security checkpoints, each one more sophisticated than the last. Biometric scanners, metal detectors, and X-ray machines processed their credentials with mechanical efficiency. Georgia found herself impressed by the thoroughness of modern security protocols, even as she mentally cataloged the vulnerabilities that someone with her training could exploit. The interrogation room was sterile and windowless, dominated by a metal table and chairs that had been bolted to the floor. Banks of recording equipment lined one wall, while a one-way mirror occupied most of another. Georgia recognized the psychological design, everything calculated to make subjects feel isolated, observed, and psychologically diminished. "He's been here since 7 this morning," Agent Rodriguez explained, consulting his tablet. "Refused breakfast, declined legal representation, and has been asking every hour when you would arrive." Through the one-way mirror, Georgia observed Klaus Richter for the first time since their conversation at Sunrise Manor. He sat perfectly upright in his chair, hands folded calmly in his lap, staring directly at the mirror as if he could see through it. Despite the harsh fluorescent lighting and institutional setting, he radiated the same controlled dignity that had characterized Heinrich Muller's carefully constructed persona. "He knows we're watching," Agent Chun observed. He's been staring at that mirror for the past 20 minutes. Georgia studied Richter's posture and expression, reading the subtle signs that revealed his psychological state. His breathing was controlled, but slightly elevated. His hands remained steady, but showed the faint tremor of someone operating on nervous energy rather than calm confidence. Most tellingly, his eyes carried the alert watchfulness of a predator who had willingly entered a trap, but remained ready to spring if the opportunity arose. "He's scared," Georgia said quietly. "Not of punishment, he's made peace with that. He's scared that we won't be competent enough to use the information he's offering effectively." Agent Chun handed Georgia a thick folder containing Klaus Richter's preliminary statements. He's already provided names, locations, and documentation for 12 individuals he claims are war criminals currently living in the United States. 2 more in Canada, 3 in Argentina, and 1 in Australia. Georgia opened the folder and immediately recognized several names from her own decades of investigation. Hans Kruger, supposedly a retired engineer in Phoenix who had actually been a concentration camp administrator. Maria Volkov, living quietly in Miami, who had been a nurse involved in the Nazi euthanasia program. Wilhelm Brenner, operating a small bakery in Toronto, who had been a logistics coordinator for deportation trains. "These are all real," Georgia confirmed, her voice carrying a note of amazement. "I've been tracking some of these people for 20 years. How did he maintain contact with so many of them?" According to his preliminary statements, they've been operating as a mutual protection network since the 1950s, Agent Rodriguez explained. Sharing intelligence about investigations, providing financial support to members in crisis, and coordinating relocations when someone's cover was threatened. Georgia felt a chill of recognition. Klaus Richter hadn't just been an individual war criminal hiding in plain sight. He had been part of an organized conspiracy that had been protecting Nazi fugitives for 7 decades. The scope of the network suggested resources and coordination that went far beyond what any single individual could have maintained. "He's also provided these," Agent Chun said, handing Georgia a second folder containing photographs, documents, and what appeared to be financial records. Bank account numbers, real estate holdings, business investments. He claims the network has been pooling resources to support members and finance new identities when necessary. Georgia studied the financial documents with growing astonishment. The network had accumulated millions of dollars in assets, carefully laundered through legitimate businesses and charitable organizations. Real estate holdings in a dozen countries, investment portfolios managed by unwitting financial advisors, and business ventures that provided both income and cover for their members. This isn't just about individual war criminals, Georgia realized. This is about an entire infrastructure that's been supporting Nazi fugitives for generations. Some of these businesses have been operating for 50 years. Agent Chun nodded grimly, and according to Richter, the network is still active. They've been recruiting new members, children and grandchildren of original Nazis who have been raised to continue the mission of protecting their elders' secrets. The revelation transformed Georgia's understanding of everything she had accomplished over the past 4 decades. She had been hunting individual war criminals, but they had been part of a coordinated network that had been studying her methods, sharing information about her investigations, and collectively developing strategies to evade capture. "He wants to see me before he provides any additional information," Agent Chun continued. "He says the preliminary statements are just evidence of good faith. The real intelligence, locations, current identities, operational details, that comes only after he speaks with you." Georgia stood up from the observation room table, mentally preparing herself for the most important conversation of her career. Klaus Richter had spent 70 years as her adversary, but now he was offering to become her most valuable asset in dismantling a network that had protected Nazi war criminals for generations. What does he want in return? Georgia asked. Agent Rodriguez consulted his notes. Protection for his daughter. She genuinely had no knowledge of his real identity. A guarantee that his confession will be used to prosecute other war criminals, rather than simply creating a media spectacle. And? Georgia prompted. He wants to die as Klaus Richter rather than Heinrich Müller, Agent Chun said quietly. He wants his real name on his death certificate, his actual crimes acknowledged in the official record. He says he's tired of being a fictional person. Georgia felt a complex mixture of respect and revulsion for Klaus Richter's final gambit. Even in surrender, he was negotiating from a position of strength, using his knowledge of the network as leverage to ensure that his capture would serve a larger purpose than simple retribution. Are you ready? Agent Chun asked, her hand on the door handle. Georgia nodded, straightening her shoulders as she prepared to enter the room where she would finally confront Klaus Richter as an equal rather than a hunter pursuing prey. The game they had been playing for decades was about to transform into something entirely different. The interrogation room door opened with a soft click, and Klaus Richter looked up from his contemplation of the mirror. His face immediately brightened with what appeared to be genuine pleasure. Georgia, he said in German, rising from his chair with the courtesy of a man greeting an old friend. I was beginning to worry that you might not come. Klaus, Georgia replied, using his real name for the first time in their acquaintance. I understand you have something to tell me. They sat across from each other at the metal table, two elderly people who had spent half their lives locked in a complex dance of pursuit and evasion. The sterile government interrogation room seemed an unlikely setting for the conclusion of their decades-long relationship, but Georgia recognized the appropriateness of the moment. I have spent 70 years running from what I did, Klaus said quietly. I have spent 70 years helping others run from what they did. I have spent 70 years believing that survival was more important than justice. I was wrong. Georgia studied his face, searching for signs of deception or manipulation. What changed your mind? Klaus smiled sadly. You did. Our conversations at Sunrise Manor reminded me that there are people who dedicate their entire lives to ensuring that evil does not go unpunished. I realized that I had been selfish to die peacefully while denying justice to the families of my victims. You're dying? Georgia asked, noting the slight tremor in his hands and the careful way he had positioned himself in the chair. Pancreatic cancer, Klaus confirmed. Diagnosed 3 months ago. I have perhaps 6 months left, maybe. Less. I decided that I would rather spend my remaining time helping to expose the network than protecting it. Georgia felt a strange sense of closure settling over her. Klaus Richter's confession wasn't just about his own crimes. It was about ensuring that an entire generation of war criminals would be held accountable before they died of natural causes. Tell me about the network, Georgia said, activating the recording device in her lapel. Klaus Richter leaned back in his chair and began to speak. For the next 4 hours, he methodically dismantled a conspiracy that had protected Nazi war criminals for 7 decades. Names, locations, financial arrangements, communication systems, and operational procedures that had taken generations to develop and perfect. He described how young SS officers had established the network in the chaos of immediate post-war Europe, how they had pooled resources to purchase false identities, establish legitimate businesses, and create safe houses across 3 continents, how they had recruited sympathizers, corrupted officials, and built an infrastructure that could support fugitives indefinitely. The network evolved, Klaus explained. What began as a desperate attempt by individual war criminals to avoid capture became a sophisticated organization with its own ideology and long-term objectives. Second and third generation members who had never committed war crimes themselves, but who believed in protecting their fathers' and grandfathers' secrets. Georgia listened in fascination as Klaus revealed the existence of legitimate businesses, charitable organizations, and even academic institutions that had been secretly controlled by the network for decades. Shell corporations that laundered money, research foundations that funded Holocaust denial, and private schools that taught revisionist history to the children of network members. How many people are we talking about? Agent Chun asked. Klaus considered the question carefully. Active members who know the network's true purpose. Perhaps 50 individuals across 6 countries. But supporters, sympathizers, and unwitting. Accomplices, hundreds, maybe thousands. Georgia felt overwhelmed by the scope of the conspiracy Klaus was describing. She had spent her entire career hunting individual war criminals, never realizing that they were part of an organized network that had been operating with the efficiency of a multinational corporation. "The evidence is all here," Klaus said, sliding a small key across the table. "Safety deposit box at First National Bank in White Plains, New York, account number 847,291. Documents, financial records, communication logs, and photographs that prove everything I've told you." Agent Chun carefully bagged the key as evidence. "Why are you doing this? Why betray people who have protected you for decades?" Klaus looked directly at Georgia as he answered. "Because I finally understood that some things are more important than loyalty to the dead. The families of my victims deserve to know the truth. The survivors deserve to see justice served. And the world deserves to know that we never stopped. Being Nazis, we just became very good at hiding it." As the interrogation concluded, Georgia realized that Klaus Richter's confession had transformed her from a lone hunter into the key witness in what would become the largest war crimes investigation in modern history. The network he had exposed would require years to fully dismantle, involving law enforcement agencies across multiple countries and potentially affecting hundreds of individuals. Klaus Richter had spent 70 years as her enemy, but in his final months, he had given her the greatest victory of her career. The question now was whether she had the strength to see it through to the end. 6 months later, Georgia stood in the observation deck of the International Criminal Court in The Hague, watching as the last member of Klaus Richter's network was led away in handcuffs. The coordinated international operation that had begun with a single confession in a Hartford interrogation room had become the most successful war crimes investigation in history. 18 arrests across 4 countries. $47 million in assets seized. Dozens of legitimate businesses and charitable organizations exposed as fronts for Nazi fugitive operations. And most importantly, justice finally served for victims whose families had waited 70 years for answers. Agent Chun joined Georgia at the observation window, both women watching as media representatives from around the world documented the conclusion of what newspapers had dubbed Operation Final Justice. "Hans Kruger was the last one," Agent Chun said, referring to the elderly man who had just been sentenced to life imprisonment for his role as a concentration camp administrator. 86 years old, and he fought extradition every step of the way. Georgia nodded, feeling a complex mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion. At 73, she had spent the past 6 months traveling between countries, testifying before international tribunals, and helping law enforcement agencies understand the intricate web of connections that had protected Nazi war criminals for generations. "Any word from the doctors about Klaus?" Agent Chun asked gently. Georgia's expression grew somber. "He died last week, pancreatic cancer as expected. But he lived long enough to see most of the network dismantled. The warden said he seemed peaceful at the end." Klaus Richter had spent his final months in federal medical custody, continuing to provide information and testimony even as his health deteriorated. True to his word, he had cooperated completely with international authorities, helping them understand not just the identities of network members, but the psychological and Operational methods that had kept them hidden for so long. What about his daughter? Agent Chun inquired. Sarah Mueller-Davidson knew nothing about her father's real identity, Georgia confirmed. She's been cleared of any wrongdoing, but she's struggling with the revelation that the man she loved as a father was responsible for hundreds of deaths. She started a foundation to support families of Holocaust victims, her way of trying to make amends for crimes she never committed. The two women stood in comfortable silence, watching as the courtroom below gradually emptied. The conclusion of the trials marked the end of Georgia's official cooperation with federal authorities. But it also raised questions about what came next for a woman who had dedicated her entire adult life to hunting war criminals. So what happens now? Agent Chun asked, voicing the question that had been haunting Georgia for months. The network is dismantled, the major players are all dead or in prison, and you're officially retired again. What does Georgia Smith do with the rest of her life? Georgia smiled wryly. Georgia Smith was always a fiction. The question is, what does the person underneath all those assumed identities do when there's no one left to hunt? The truth was that Georgia had been struggling with this question ever since Klaus Richter's death. For 43 years, her identity had been defined by the pursuit of justice for war crimes. She had never married, never had children, never developed interests or relationships that weren't somehow connected to her mission. The successful conclusion of that mission left her facing an existential crisis that she hadn't anticipated. The Bureau has offered you a consulting position, Agent Chun said carefully. War crimes investigation, international fugitive tracking, training new agents in deep cover operations. You could help us develop better methods for identifying and capturing criminals who think they're safely hidden. Georgia considered the offer, recognizing both its attractions and its limitations. Working officially with the FBI would provide structure and resources, but it would also mean operating within bureaucratic constraints that had never suited her independent methods. There's something else, Agent Chun continued. We've been analyzing the documents Klaus provided, and we think his network might not have been the only one. There are financial patterns and communication intercepts that suggest similar organizations might exist for other types of international criminals. Georgia felt a familiar stirring of interest. What kind of criminals? War criminals from more recent conflicts. Yugoslavia, Rwanda, Cambodia, Syria. People who have committed genocide and crimes against humanity, but who have managed to disappear into diaspora communities in Western countries. The possibility of a new hunt, a new purpose, sparked something in Georgia that had been dormant since Klaus Richter's confession. For 70 years, she had focused exclusively on Nazi war criminals, but the techniques she had developed could be adapted to pursue perpetrators of more recent atrocities. How many people are we talking about? Georgia asked. Agent Chun pulled out a tablet and showed Georgia a map covered with red dots. Conservative estimates suggest there are over 200 suspected war criminals from post-Cold War conflicts currently living in the United States. Some have been here for decades, others arrived more recently as refugees. Most are living under their real names because there's no international infrastructure for tracking them. Georgia studied the map, her mind automatically beginning to categorize the challenges involved in hunting modern war criminals. Unlike Nazi fugitives who had decades to establish false identities, more recent perpetrators often relied on the chaos of refugee resettlement and overwhelmed immigration systems. They might be easier to identify but harder to prosecute, especially if they had entered the country legally as asylum seekers. What about the international legal framework? Georgia asked. Nazi war crimes are well established in international law, but more recent conflicts involve complex political situations, where one person's war criminal might be another person's freedom fighter. Agent Chun nodded. That's exactly why we need someone with your experience. You understand how to navigate the political complexities while maintaining focus on the evidence of actual crimes. Georgia walked to the window overlooking The Hague's historic city center, where centuries of international law and diplomacy had been shaped by humanity's ongoing struggle to define justice. The conclusion of Klaus Richter's network had been satisfying, but it had also revealed the enormous scope of unpunished atrocities that continued to demand attention. "I'll need complete operational independence," Georgia said finally. "No bureaucratic oversight, no political considerations, and no restrictions on the methods I use to gather evidence." Agent Chun smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that. There's a private foundation that's been established to support international justice initiatives, funded by tech billionaires and human rights organizations, completely independent of government oversight. They're looking for an experienced investigator to lead their war crimes tracking division." Georgia turned from the window, her mind already racing through possibilities. A new hunt would mean new identities, new countries, new challenges. But it would also mean continuing the work that had defined her life, adapted for a new generation of criminals who thought they had escaped justice. "When do they want to meet?" Georgia asked. Agent Chun checked her watch. "There's a car waiting downstairs. The Foundation's board is meeting in Geneva this afternoon, and they've specifically requested your presence." As they prepared to leave The Hague, Georgia took one last look at the courtroom where Klaus Richter's network had faced justice. The elderly war criminals who had been sentenced would spend their remaining years in prison, finally held accountable for crimes committed in their youth. But their capture had also revealed the existence of newer networks, younger criminals, and ongoing atrocities that demanded the same relentless pursuit. "You know," Agent Chun said as they walked toward the elevator, "Klaus Richter was right about one thing. You really are remarkable at what you do. Most people would have retired after successfully dismantling a 70-year-old conspiracy. You're already planning the next hunt." Georgia smiled, feeling more energized than she had in months. "Agent Chun, I've spent my entire adult life learning how to find people who don't want to be found. That's not a skill you retire from. It's a calling you answer until the day you die." The elevator doors opened, and Georgia stepped inside, already mentally preparing for the next phase of her extraordinary career. Klaus Richter had given her the greatest victory of her life, but he had also shown her that the pursuit of justice was never truly finished. There would always be new monsters hiding in plain sight, new networks protecting them, and new opportunities to ensure that evil did not go unpunished. At 73, Georgia Smith was about to embark on the most ambitious hunt of her career. The suburban grandmother who had spent 15 years tending roses and volunteering at charity events was once again transforming into one of the world's most effective hunters of war criminals. The game was beginning again, and this time, the stakes were higher than ever. 3 months later, a woman calling herself Elena Vasquez arrived in Phoenix, Arizona, to begin work as a translator for an immigrant services organization. She was particularly interested in helping refugees from the Balkans and Central Africa, people who had fled violence and were trying to rebuild their lives in America. Her neighbors in the modest apartment complex where she lived saw exactly what she wanted them to see: a dedicated social worker who spent her days helping traumatized refugees navigate American bureaucracy, and her evenings learning new languages to better serve her clients. What they didn't see was the way Elena's eyes automatically cataloged every face she encountered, comparing them to photographs she had memorized from war crimes tribunals. They didn't notice how she positioned herself at community gatherings to overhear conversations in languages most Americans couldn't identify. They didn't realize that her genuine compassion for refugees was coupled with an unforgiving determination to ensure that the perpetrators of their suffering didn't escape justice. Elena Vasquez was Georgia Smith's newest identity, and she had work to do. In a community center in Phoenix, surrounded by families who had fled genocide and ethnic cleansing, the world's most successful war crimes hunter was beginning her next investigation. The techniques that had brought down Klaus, Richter's network were being adapted for a new generation of monsters who thought they were safely hidden among the very people they had victimized. The hunt never ended. It simply evolved. And somewhere, in the American Southwest, justice was once again being served by a woman who had spent her entire life ensuring that evil could never hide forever, no matter how carefully it disguised itself or how many years it had been running. The story of Georgia Smith was far from over. It was just entering its next chapter. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.